I'm Chris Nemacheck. I'm a professor in the government department, and I teach American politics with a focus on the courts and civil liberties and civil rights issues. Um, and I taught in the DC semester, the very first semester of the program back in fall 2006, and it was an exciting opportunity then, a little bit scary, wanting to make sure I, I did a good enough job that it was successful. But I had a great experience in DC. I taught a semester sort of law and politics in the nation's capital, and had a great time doing the program. And the students had great internships, and the experience was really positive. So I ended up coming back a few more times and teaching both semester and then some shorter programs. So Anne, how about you?
Well, my name is Ann Rasmussen. I'm a professor in the Department of Music. I've also been involved in Asian and Middle Eastern studies on campus for a couple of decades, maybe even a little more. I direct the William and Mary Middle Eastern Music Ensemble. And I'm an ethnomusicologist, so I teach about music and cultures of the world and music as a window onto society and culture. And I remember when the call came out for proposals for the Washington semester. And I mean, I think I sat down and wrote it in an afternoon. I had been taking students to Washington for day trips, and we would meet in Ewell Circle at 6 o'clock in the morning with a crate of donuts and some coffee, and I would drive up there and park, and we would typically go to the National Endowment for the Arts, to the Library of Congress, American Folklife Center, and to Smithsonian Folkways Recordings, which is part of the Smithsonian Museums, and then whatever else we could do in DC, and then we'd jump in the car and drive home. So I had been kind of communicating and collaborating and in touch with the people in the business of culture and the arts in DC. And so when the call came out, I just got down on my laptop and created a proposal, which was then, kind of to my surprise, accepted. And all of a sudden, the next semester, I was on my way to DC. So the name of my semester was Washington in the Arts, and I was lucky enough to be able to do this 12 years later in 2019. So I have a lot of as I'm sure, Chris, you do too, a lot of perspective on back then and now, and the way the city has changed, the way students have changed, the way we teach has changed. But I would do it again in a heartbeat. I really would. It's an amazing way for students and faculty, I think, to learn together. Like, you put together a template, but then you are like knitting the scarf together row by row, and everybody's experience feeds into the collective.
You two are amazing. I have a giant smile on my face listening to both of you tell these stories. You're perfect, totally perfect. All right, the next question, I'm going to have Anne, you answer first. And remember to repeat back sort of the general question, but what was your approach to teaching at the Washington Center the first time around? And had you ever heard of anything like this before?
Well, I'm really interested in the other Washington, the Washington of people, of communities, of creativity, of social protest, social justice, social movements. And that's because the colleagues that I have up there do very much what I do. I'm in the world of ethnomusicology and folklore and sort of anthropology of culture and performance, but they do it in a way that is applied. So they're really working with museum exhibits and concerts and productions and archives and venues and so forth. And so I wanted to have my academic interests live through the real world of Washington, D.C., the Washington, D.C. that's not policy, that's not necessarily government, although those things, have a lot to do with the arts world. And And also the incredible sort of multiculturalism of Washington, D.C. You know, Washington, D.C. as the chocolate city with an African American majority for much of its history. You know, the growth of the city as a physical, as an aesthetic thing. So my approach to teaching was really to take what I knew and kind of the readings that I knew and the music that I knew, but really map onto that real human beings in the business of culture. So colleagues that I knew, but also colleagues that I was meeting, primarily Roxanne, because of you and your team and your incredible talent and knack for outreach, not only to our alumni, but to other institutions that I never would have thought of, or I never would have made that cold call. So it was really a collaborative experience teaching. I mean, I had some ideas, but then I think the center and the setting of DC and the infrastructure of the Washington office program, the Washington program office, really helped to take my kind of, teaching initiatives to a bigger, better, higher, alive kind of experience. Chris, what about you?
So in terms of my approach, it was probably one of the most interesting challenges that I'd encountered, in that there was no sort of structure prior to the first semester. And so I remember, I was in on the interview with Roxanne, and so impressed with her early on that I was so excited when she joined the team, and we basically had to figure out, thinking about credit hours and how that was going to work for our students and transfer, and some really, really practical things. And then also just really excited about the opportunity to have my students. It's mail call here now, so we're going to need to edit this out. There's no stopping what's happening right now.
We'll take a brief time out.
Oh God. Shall we just wait until he quits?
Yeah.
Right.
It'll be pretty short-lived. Yeah, the mail comes in through a slot, and that just it's a breach. It's a security breach of the highest order.
How lovely that it just comes right into your door and you don't even have to walk to the mailbox.
Lovely and not, Roxanne. The question is then, does it make it past security without being bitten and, kind of shredded a little bit? Bosco, come here, buddy. Come on. Sorry about that. All right, I think he should be dying down. Okay, so maybe I'll just start over.
Yes, yeah. I think you're going to need to start over. Yep.
Okay, that sounds good.
You need the prompt again, or you're good?
No, I think I'm good. So my approach to teaching up in DC was really different than any other challenge I've had in teaching a course, in that everything was new. When I was thinking about and formulating my semester, down to the number of credits that the students were going to need and how we were going to sort of divvy those credits up in a way that was reasonable for the students and accommodating the work they were doing, because there was going to be a lot of work in terms of their internships and then the corresponding classroom work, and then thinking about just sort of, how many of the sort of site visits and experiences like that we'd have with the students. And so it was a really interesting process in terms of formulating sort of what we thought would work for my semester, but also what we thought would be a good structure for semesters going forward. And we were I was in on the interview with Roxanne, and she was so fantastic. And she came on, I think, Roxanne will have to correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was during that first semester she started in the office. But by the time of the first semester began, of course, most of the stuff had to be sort of, in place. As Anne's mentioned, it is certainly a process of sort of stitching the semester together as we go along, which I think is one of the great benefits of teaching in a program like the Washington program, both in terms of the number of students, but the fact that they're all learning so much in their internship experiences that's directly related to the course material. So they tend to have more ideas and questions about sort of different topics that they might want to discuss than is true of students on campus who are really learning primarily through what I've assigned in the course, which of course the students in DC were learning as well, but it was also informed by these experiences they were all having in internships that overlapped with the content of the course. And that for me was one of the most exciting aspects of the program, along with the opportunity to interact with all of these policymakers and folks working in and around the legal system. So there were connections I made with various policymakers and so forth during that first semester in 2006 that I still have today. In fact, someone that I had in to meet with my students that very first semester came in and gave a talk about election law and sort of the presidential election just the week before the election this year, and fairly regularly, unfortunately for him, I bug him about talking to classes, but and he didn't have a connection with the college even, and I mean, Anne mentioned the sort of cold calls that we Roxanne made and that we made prior to the semester, and it was, I mean, the connections were great, but it was also really I don't know, I think it was liberating in a way for me as a faculty member to just reach out to people in a way that I don't know that I would have done had I not been involved in the semester. And because I did it that semester, I just sort of have continued doing it. And it's always amazing to me the people who will give a couple hours of their time to students and just create these really fantastic educational opportunities. So, I guess trying to figure out helping the students with their internships and thinking about places where students could intern, where future students might also be able to intern. For better or for worse, topics involving law in Washington, D.C. are pretty transferable to many different semesters. And so also establishing relationships with the people who are in those various institutions. And that was, we had a few students in who were working with members of Congress, staffing with the Judiciary Committee. We had one student who was in the White House. We had another student working on judicial stuff from the White House, from the executive perspective. We met with several different judges, several of whom I've continued to meet with when my classes have gone up to DC, both as part of the program in the future semesters that I taught, as well as just, day trips and that sort of thing. So I think the idea of thinking about the class with a real focus on sort of the student's experience outside the classroom as well as inside the classroom really just it's a different way of thinking about teaching than is typical on sort of on a campus in a classroom, where the way I was taught was mostly you're just going to learn all this stuff from books and from the instructor and so forth. And this just opened up a whole new range of opportunities, I think, for the students and for me as a faculty member to think about connections and ways I could make the material relevant to the students.
That's so cool. Chris, it just listening to you talk reminds me of the incredibly gratifying experience it was to invite some of my heroes, people who I really admire. And I did this again, in 2019. And one of the things I think about bringing a group of students to a colleague, like if I were just going to sit down and say, hey, Dan Sheehy, you amazing person that I've admired all my life, can I just come and meet with you? Sure, I could come and meet with him. We'd have a great conversation. He could tell me about all the things he was doing. But to sort of put that person in front of a group of students, they present in a way that's really kind of more comprehensive. They talk about why it matters. And since you're there and you can say like, hey, that's a really interesting point, or could you expand on that? Or, you can help to kind of bring them out, and, you get excited about what your guest is talking about. They see, the kind of karma that's happening between the professor and the guest. And it's just, it's even different than inviting a guest to campus, particularly because, you mentioned that visiting guests. I mean, what I did on our Fridays, and of course, since you were semester number 1 and I was semester number 2, I called my Fridays Friday Seminar in the City. And we basically went to places. So, to go to the National Endowment for the Arts and see, where they were in the old post office building. You know what the old post office building is now? It's some giant Trump hotel, right? So, I mean, I was thinking about ways in which, things are different. Or, going to the Kennedy Center and not just hearing about programming, but, walking through these spaces, seeing where people work, the Library of Congress, or the archives at, a Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, where Smithsonian Folkways recordings are. I mean, not everybody gets to go and stand in those archives with all these historic recordings and like seeing, the very old, tape recording machines of, someone who is a hero to me. Maybe they're not a hero to my students, but at least they could catch a little bit of my enthusiasm. I think that's what's really different about teaching in DC, is that it's just, it's such a kick to be in these spaces with these people and giving them, a forum to kind of really, roll it on out in ways that they wouldn't do just between, the two of us as colleagues or whatever. So that was really exciting.
And it was always, our students would come up with, as usual, they were they were one of the biggest assets that we could have in those engagements, right? The questions and so forth that they'd come up with were fantastic. And again, informed not only by what we've been talking about in the classroom, but their own experiences that they were having in their internships. Yeah, I agree. There is something entirely different about actually inhabiting the place that you're talking about, and the place where I'm just thinking of, we went one of our Friday seminars. We went to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals and met with a judge, and we saw oral arguments. And then after the oral arguments, while the judges were deliberating, the judge we were meeting with actually brought in several of his law clerks and had the students all sort of sitting in the room where the clerks were doing their work. And they basically had an hour to talk with these law clerks about their own experiences and so forth. And that's something, I didn't know it was going to happen before we got to the building. But it would never, it couldn't happen, right? Unless you were in that place.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. And it was really great. It was really great.
Yeah. A lot of times the students would say like, well, what's going to happen? And you say, well, I'm not really sure. We're going to go there and we'll see. Yeah. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
You two are amazing. This is perfect. I don't even have to prompt you with the questions, because you're going through all of this just naturally. You're totally perfect. So I don't want to ask you too many questions you haven't been prepared for in advance, but let's do it this way. If you were going to speak to a colleague who is new to William & Mary, hasn't taught up in the Washington Center, what would you tell them were the benefits, and what's the most rewarding aspect of teaching in DC? And I think we're on Chris to start this time, right? Or did you start?
Yeah, I think so. So if I was talking to a new colleague about teaching in DC and what might be the best, sort of the biggest benefits of that process, I think it would be a long conversation because I think there are quite a few benefits. And I mean, the opportunity, particularly, I'm sure Anne can give some perspective on this as well. The opportunity to be in DC doing your own work as well as teaching, right? For me, there's material at the Library of Congress that I was able to work on during that semester that had I been at William and Mary, I wouldn't have been able to easily do. It would have been much more difficult. It could have been done, but the hurdles to do that would have been much more significant. And I do think the opportunity to interact with people who are working, in the same area, but in an applied way is just really beneficial. I learned a lot, particularly being a new faculty member and, being a new sort of a junior scholar in my field. It was helpful for me to be able to ask some judges and some folks who were writing briefs for the court and so forth. It was helpful for me to ask about their process. I knew about it from the academic side of things, but there were some questions that academics either haven't studied because it's difficult to study, difficult to get data on and so forth. And you really learn best about it through talking to the people who are doing the work. And that was amazing to be able to have that experience. And I think, it was obviously beneficial for our students to learn that way. But I was also able to learn. And I think, Anne mentioned earlier that the idea that you were learning along with your students, that was really true. And there were some things that, certainly there were opportunities to learn things I couldn't have learned on campus because of these, location or various hurdles that would have been in the way, or trying to do something that would have extended over a couple weeks and just not possible during the semester and that sort of thing. But there's also, I think, something really different about teaching that way, as saying to your students, we're all going to figure this out together. This is a problem. We come across these problems all the time in doing, whether it's research or writing or teaching, and here's how we have to figure this out. And I think the fact that you are all up in DC as a group, there's also sort of a connection between faculty and students, and the students with themselves as well, that doesn't necessarily exist when you're on campus. It's, you're sort of in this little incubator and you go up there and you're all together. Yeah. And I think that has some real benefits for that process of learning together. And I think that has made, even being on campus and teaching since then, I think that helped me to sort of develop the idea that if I don't know how something's going to work, then I'm still going to try it. And I'm going to tell the students, I'm not sure how this is going to work. We're going to figure it out together. And I think I really first started doing that through the DC program. And that's just an incredibly valuable skill. And maybe skill's too strong a word. It's an incredibly valuable sort of lesson, I guess, to learn that you can do that. And it can be a really great experience in the classroom. So I think I'd emphasize sort of all the areas that we tend to think about in terms of development as faculty members, the opportunities for your research and the opportunities for your teaching and for sort of working on your teaching and sort of how you relate to students in the classroom, as well as it was also a lot of fun. It simply was. So I went to grad school in DC, and so it was a little coming home for me. So it was great. I really enjoyed it. And it's funny, the bonds with those students, I still keep in touch with those students as well. In fact, a few years ago, I was in Australia, and one of those students was doing a graduate program in Australia, and we met up and traveled for a day, doing a little day trip together and that sort of thing. And, lots of students around that I still see on homecoming and, that kind of thing. And sometimes I live in Richmond, and sometimes I see them in Richmond, the ones who are living here. So it was a very, very rewarding experience. I've gone on too long. Anne, how about you? What would you say?
Okay. All right. What would I say to a new faculty about the William and Mary in DC experience, being the semester professor? I think in some ways it's the quintessential liberal arts experience. We all are in our departments, and I think, because we present them with this model, students think, okay, that's the music person, that's the government person, whatever. But I think all of us are incredibly interdisciplinary in our outlooks. We may not be able to go to as many, conferences in other disciplines that we want to, or read as widely. But when you're in DC, you really are, you're kind of encouraged to apply your discipline in a broad way. One, because although my semester was called William and Mary and the Arts, and I was very much interested not in arts as like what is the most beautiful painting or sculpture or whatever, but what is arts policy? What is the patronage of the arts? What does that mean? Do we have a national culture, right? We don't have a Ministry of Culture in the United States. So when there are international conferences and everybody sends their minister from the Ministry of Culture, we don't have anybody to send. So how does culture work in the United States, right? How does music work? How does dance work? Is it merely up to the vicious rhythms of capitalism? Like if people like it and they buy it, it works. And so I was really interested in these questions. I wanted to look back on the internships that the students had back in spring of 2007. So I'm just going to rattle them off here. 3 were at museums: the National Portrait Gallery, the National Gallery of Art, and the National Museum of American History. I also had one at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. They were all doing very different things in those museums, from publicity to finance to curation to, I'm sure, they did Xeroxing and making coffee and errands and all the things that anybody does in any job, right? That's another thing about an internship experience, right? Everybody has to stand in front of a Xerox machine, no matter how many PhDs you have. Everybody has to deal with, Blackboard or Banner or these kind of money things. But they were also doing, just learning about these organizations. I had a couple people in media. I had somebody at National Geographic Traveler magazine, at Slate.com, at NPR, All Things Considered. And then I had people working in institutions, one at the Choral Arts Society of Washington, one at the Woolly Mammoth Theater, and I had a student who was working at Red Dirt Studios, working with a sculptor in her studio, making stuff, preparing whatever sculptors prepare, wood and concrete and stone. And then I had somebody at Smithsonian Folkways Recordings and Center for American Progress, right? So we had government, we had media, we had arts, we had music, and one of the great things, in addition to sort of the academic part of it, was these students were bringing their experiences in, and they were also bringing what they knew in. So if they had heard, oh, this cool thing is happening on Friday night, or why don't we all go check out this? We could do that as a group. In addition to that, there were events at the DC Center. So as Chris was saying, you were just with your students more. The challenge was to separate the Friday class from the Tuesday, Thursday evening class from their internship, right? So it's like, as a professor, you're wearing these 3 different hats, right? So you say, well, I'll give you an extension on the Friday assignment if you do the Tuesday, Thursday assignment, rather than having, different professors play those different roles in their lives. That was challenging. But But the fact that we could do things together, we could go ice skating together, we could, show up for, for some sort of conference or event or meeting or something at the DC office, or we could go and visit some of the students in their internship settings. So visiting Smithsonian Folkways recordings when Kylie, one of our students, was an intern there, was a total kick. And I know during the spring break, I had my kids then were in high school and middle school, and they just came up for the week, and I took advantage of all my students that had great internships. We went to a play at Woolly Mammoth Theater. We went behind the scenes and in the Museum of American History. I mean, we got to see Herbie Hancock's original Moog synthesizer and, all these awesome guitar. I mean, behind the exhibit halls. And so in addition to all of the academic connections and enlightenment that happened, there was this really wonderful social discovery, or for students who were from DC, rediscovery of that city, because we had set this other agenda for ourselves. I was thinking about some of the differences between 2007 and 2019. We were all on the internet and communicating by email, and we did our document management on Blackboard, but we were much less governed by Facebook and Instagram and Spotify and all of these other things. I feel like there was more of a real-time experience of DC. The other thing that was interesting about 2007 was that we were living right behind the Capitol. Chris, I'm sure you lived up there too, and that and getting on the metro at Union Station every day and coming over to DuPont Circle, that made for this other common experience. So whether in the first year of the William and Mary Washington semester program or right now, I think there is certainly the opportunity, and I would say you'd be wrong not to take that opportunity to discover the city kind of anew with your students. One of the great things, since we were interested in arts and culture, we just tried to have on our radar anything that was free, right? Any free thing. And so students would, they say, oh, I heard this free thing is happening, or this happy hour thing, or this concert, or this whatever, and we take advantage of that. I'm just thinking one of the very cool things is going out with urban planners. And Roxanne, you're the one that put us in touch with some of the people that are really involved in the development of DC. And for example, looking at the whole U Street corridor and walking up and down and seeing, the Lincoln Theater and, some of these incredibly historic spaces and places that came to life again when one of our students in 2019 was working at the 930 Club, which is this legendary music venue for pop and rock musicians since forever, right, in the country. But then also talking about what other venues the 930 Club manages, and and how that all works, and all the different roles that have to be filled to make rock and roll happen on a Friday night. So going out to the 930 Club this time was a great compliment to visiting the U Street corridor in 2007 on a freezing day, back in whatever it was, February or March 20 years ago. Not quite 20 years ago.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to ask one last question that Anne can answer first and then pass to Chris. And then before we close, I'll give you each, if you have anything else you want to say, kind of 60 seconds. So my final question is, so we're celebrating 20 years of a Washington Center. Now, granted, we didn't start teaching in 2001, but shortly after. So 20 years of a Washington Center. Think forward a little bit. So when in another 20 years, what does Washington Center look like, and how might you engage with teaching in 20 years from now?
Wow. Let me think on that for a minute. I think there are so many institutions that have amazing staying power in DC, and it's quite interesting to check back in on those institutions or those scenes. For example, when in 2007 we were in the Bush administration, we went through two Obama administrations after that. In 2019, when I started, spring of 2019, the government was in shutdown, right? We came to DC and the government was shut down. We had two students, one of whom was working in the speech writing department at the White House for Donald Trump, who couldn't start his internship for several weeks. And another who, kind of flailed around before they really landed an internship. But we watched the city crawl out of the shutdown, and so being able to see a progression of how things have evolved. For example, I mentioned the National Endowment for the Arts used to be at the old post office building. It's not there now, right? It's over, it's over on the way to the beautiful wharf area. I think I would want to check back in on some of the questions that I've been asking for my entire career. Where does power lie in the production of the arts? How can I, fight back against this idea that Washington is all about government and business and women wearing pointy high-heeled shoes? There is a whole other Washington there, and there are, stories to be told that are evolving and that are extremely important. For example, what Chris is doing now on campus with our Call 350 requirement, to really think about in our teaching issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, race, and so forth. I mean, you can apply that immediately by taking a tour of the monuments, right? You go down to the Lincoln Memorial, you look at the MLK Memorial, you look at the Vietnam Memorial. Oh, and then over there, oh, there's some women there. Oh, well, then lo and behold, oh, well, why don't we, what about the Native Americans? I mean, these questions, intellectual history is constantly changing, right? So in 20 years, we'll be looking back and saying, why wasn't anybody talking about this? Why didn't anybody think about that? Where was that story in the narrative, right? And that's constantly, what we're in the middle of. We're asking the questions that are relevant today, that build on and that revise the questions that were asked yesterday. And tomorrow we will be asking, related questions of the same stuff, of the same, the same art, the same theater, the same, the same, I don't know, marketing to people and who likes what and why do they like it and who gets heard and who doesn't get heard. So if I were lucky enough to teach again in the DC program in 20 years, I think I would be able to revisit, I would hope I would be able to revisit some of the same broad areas of art and creative expression in the public sphere within some of the same institutions, like the Smithsonian, like the Kennedy Center, like the Architecture Center in Alexandria, and the many places, the many other people and places that we visited, and to see where those people, artistic movements, ideas have landed. Where have they traveled? I would love to do it. I would go back. Roxanne, all you have, I'm a phone call away. So just looking for my next excuse. What about you, Chris? Whoops.
Chris, you're on mute. Start over.
Sorry, I thought there was a little noise on my end, so I had muted myself. So I'll take a pause and then start. So if I had the opportunity to go back and think about the DC office in 20 years, I think that I think I will echo some of the things that Anne mentioned. The idea of being able to help my students and to help my students understand how things have changed over that time and what things have not changed, because there's also, particularly in terms of the government and thinking about the courts and so forth, they are incredibly slow to change. And so but 20 years is enough time that we see some change. And so I think it would be really, really valuable to think about the ways in which there have been advancements, probably some setbacks, and the things that have not changed. And I think content-wise, with the material that I work on, I think I've done 4 different programs now through the DC office. And what I've found is that as my interests have changed a bit over the time that I have been working on my own research and so forth, I've been able to find new ways to incorporate that material into programs that are going on at the DC office. And I think that's one of the real assets of the office, is the fact that it provides sort of these wonderful people who work to help you do, basically as a faculty member, what you want to do. and I hope that aspect of the DC office itself doesn't change. I do think, I just think of all the students that have been through these programs and all of the experiences they've had. And in 20 years, those students are also going to be doing some really great things in the world. And it would be, I think, sort of an additional benefit that hopefully we as an institution, William & Mary as an institution, will acquire, is just these students who've had those experiences now out in the world and willing to help our new students to have these incredible experiences. I've been around William & Mary long enough now to be able to call on some of those students that I hooked up with alums in the past and say, hey, you're now doing these really pertinent things to what my students are learning. How about, if you mentor a student or talk to a student or provide an internship. And I think that's one of the real benefits of our very strong alumni network. And again, making the kinds of connections that you can make with these students when you're in these programs. Those ties, as we talked about earlier, those ties continue to bind over the years. And I think that provides for a great renewable resource for the center. So I guess I think of 20 years on of just thinking about new programs that the center might be able to offer, and the ability really to, this web that we've sort of built covering the district and beyond is strengthened in such a way that we just have even more exciting opportunities for our students to take advantage of. And so, 20 years on, I hope I can come back up there and do something, although I don't know that I want to wait for 20 years, but I think there'll just continue to be some really wonderful opportunities.
Excellent. Well, you're both on my speed dial because I've called you both many times. Although I prefer these sessions with wine, but that's okay. We can do morning coffees too. All right. So final thoughts then. No real prompts other than, no more than 60 seconds. And Chris, you can go first. Any final reflections on the Washington Center itself, where it's been, your experiences, just kind of, clips that we might want to use to wrap this up, and you can certainly take a moment to think.
Okay. It was the 60-second part that scared me, Roxanne. So, so I will try to be brief. So let me think of how to frame that. So, and this is just, Roxanne, will you repeat? So you said it was just sort of what we wanted to talk about, but.
Yes. And basically anything you haven't had a chance to talk about yet. So any reflections on the center, history, your experiences with the center, the fact that we're celebrating this milestone, any kind of final clips. When you think about what you think about the Washington Center, what haven't we given you a chance to mention yet?
All right, that sounds good. So one of the things that I that I think about with the Washington Center is just how pleased I am that I actually took up the opportunity to participate when I did. It wasn't without some trepidation. I was still a relatively new faculty member, and it was kind of an unknown. And it turned out that, I mean, first of all, it was such fun doing the program, but then having the opportunity to go back several times since then. I really value what the Washington Center provides for both our faculty and our students. And I really value the opportunities that our students get there. And so it's had, I think, a profound impact on my life as a faculty member. And I'm really grateful for that. So, so mostly, I guess, just having that opportunity. I'm glad I took it. Sometimes you look back and think, oh, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't done that. And I'm really glad I did that.
Yeah. Chris, profound impact hits the nail right on the head. I think profound impact for faculty, for students, for faculty who are considering teaching in DC. It is such a gift to be able to work with the staff there, to have people who have your back, who are interested in what you're doing, who are ready to support you, who are ready to support the students. Whether it's, going to the emergency room at 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday because somebody had an allergic reaction to something, who is a foreign student, who can't just call their mom, to having, Roxanne wander into your office and say, hey, we have this alum who does this and that or this and that. They are so enthusiastic and so positive in the Washington office. Not to say that our administrative support isn't on campus, but they are spread thin. Our admins are spread thin, and we don't have that kind of collaborative, collaborative effort towards all the nuts and bolts, including snacks and balloons. And, we, for example, produced Women in the Arts in DC. This was a conference that dovetailed with 100 Years of Women at William and Mary. I mean, if it weren't for Roxanne, really with her kind of event production outlook and being able to help the students produce their own, day-long event, I wouldn't have been brave enough to do that. So that's been, having that staff support and that staff interest and engagement has been phenomenal. Coming out of Williamsburg for a semester, it's just, it's so refreshing. And I think you say, oh, it was life-changing. I mean, it was life-changing for me 2 times. I have no doubt it was life-changing for all of the students who participated in my programs, to the extent that some of them are, found their careers during that semester. They might not have found them the next day, but they found their careers during that semester of William and Mary in Washington. I could go on, Roxanne.
No, you're totally perfect. You're unbelievable. This is absolutely amazing. The content here is just amazing. And I was just messaging Erin actually about how when you say these words, it makes me just feel really proud of the center, but you give us a lot of credit when you're the ones who make this happen. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.